Recently, I came across this interesting chess study. At first glance, in this position, there is absolute equality. After all, black has only a minor piece with which he can't checkmate us in any way. Well, white, in turn, has two pawns, which, although strong, seem to be easily stopped by his pieces. However, in fact, in this position, white has a not very difficult, but very beautiful win. I suggest you pause the video and try to find it on your own. Well then, let's move on to the correct solution. Since there are not so many variations in this study, we will go through all of them. And let's start with the pawns. If we push the pawn to the square d7, this is the easiest way for white to get a draw. But we are interested only in victory. Here, black simply gives his bishop in exchange for our pawn. And it doesn't matter what we will do next, push the pawn or take the bishop. In any case, the pawn doesn't go through and we get bare kings. Let's go back. What will happen if we push the pawn to the square c7? In that case, we simply give the black king the square d7, and he gladly steps there. Now he threatens to take the pawn on the square d6. The only defense from this is the move king b8, but black doesn't have to take the pawn and give his bishop. Here he simply goes to the square a6. He makes a waiting move, and after the move, for example king a7, he takes the pawn on the square d6. The pawn is still controlled by the bishop, and if we take the bishop, we get again only bare kings on the board. So, as we have seen, in this position, white is forced to move the king. And let's go through all possible king moves. At first glance, it is the move king b8. After all, this move attacks the bishop and also gets closer to the promotion squares of the pawns. But black finds a rather strong reply, king d8. Now he has protected the bishop and passes the move to white. It turns out that we can't push the pawns because if we push the pawn to the square c7, black retreats with the king to the square d7. And we get the line we already analyzed. And if we push the pawn to the square d7, then black takes and gives his bishop in exchange for our two pawns, and again we get an equal position. Well, if in this position we retreat with the king to the square a7, then black can already simply move the bishop to the square e6, and our pawns can't go through in any way, since the king is too far away. If he were standing on the square b8, it would be a completely different matter. Well then, since the move king b8 didn't work, probably the correct answer is king b6, with the idea to get to the square c7. But here, white again stumbles on the annoying reply king d8. Now, our king also can't get through anywhere, and pushing the pawns is still useless. We have to go back. But here, black can simply go with the bishop to the square e6, and we get the line we already analyzed. As we have found out, the only correct move for white is king a8, which at first glance looks rather strange because our king doesn't attack the bishop, doesn't help our pawns. But now we use one interesting circumstance. The black bishop can't move anywhere because on the square c8 he stands perfectly. If he goes to the square a6, then we approach with our king to the square b8 and already start threatening to push the pawns. If black goes with the king to the square d8, then we simply push the pawn to the square d7, drive out the opponent's king, and promote our pawn to the square d8. Now we can notice that if the bishop were standing on the square c8, he would calmly take the pawn, and it would be a draw. But the bishop on the square a6 is rather bad. Let's go back. What will happen if he retreats with the bishop already along this diagonal? In that case, we again approach with our king to the square b7. We can also go to the square b8. Here it doesn't really matter. And after the move king d8, we play the pawn to the square c7. And now we again notice that the bishop on the square c8 was standing perfectly. Then he would block the pawn, and black could calmly retreat with the king to the square d7. But if he retreats with the king to the square d7 now, then we promote the pawn to a queen. And if he retreats with the king, for example, to the square e8, we still promote the pawn. And our passed pawn, in any case, wins us this game. It is precisely because the black bishop is immobile that the move king a8 is, in fact, distant opposition. Now, after black goes to the square d8, we take the opposition with the move king b8, and we get the same position as after the move king b8 right away. But this time, it is black's move. He can't retreat with the king because the bishop would be lost. And after any bishop move, white wins. If he goes with the bishop to the square a6, then follows the move d7, and the line we already analyzed. And if he goes with the bishop along this diagonal or to any other square, then we simply play the pawn to the square c7. And after the king retreats, we promote it to a queen. Well, I hope you enjoyed this study. And now we can move on to the next interesting study. We will examine a study by Henri Rinck, where, at the very start, both bishops are under attack. Yet despite this, white manages to achieve victory in the position. If you would like to find the winning continuation for white on your own, please pause the video now. Before I show the correct answer, I would kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel if you enjoy analyses of in-game studies like this one. Now, let us move on to the solution. First, we need to determine which of the bishops must be sacrificed and which one must retreat. It is obvious that the light-squared bishop must be preserved, since it creates an X-ray against the opposing king. Throughout the entire study, the main idea will be to jump with the knight and deliver a check with the bishop. This forms the basis of white's winning strategy. Therefore, the bishop that must retreat is precisely this one. The only question that remains is to which square should it retreat? It is immediately clear that the bishop must remain on the long diagonal. From here, we can identify several candidate squares: c6, f3, g2, and h1. None of these squares are attacked by the opponent's rook. Let us first examine the move bishop to f3. In this case, the rook delivers a double attack on both the bishop and the king. No matter how the king retreats, black simply sacrifices the exchange on the next move. As a result, white cannot achieve victory here, because black eventually captures all of white's pieces. The game ends in a draw, since black is left with only the edge pawn. Thus, we are left with three remaining candidate squares: c6, g2, and h1. Now let us consider bishop to c6. Naturally, black responds by capturing the bishop on f4. And now, no matter where the king retreats, for example to g5, black plays rook to c4. The idea is simple. Black intends to sacrifice the rook for the bishop. Whatever move white makes with the bishop, the rook will follow and continue attacking it. If white plays bishop to f3, the rook follows with rook to d3. If white plays bishop to h1, the rook follows with rook to d1. In every case, the bishop remains under constant attack. And if white tries to leave the diagonal altogether, black simply captures the knight, leaving white with no winning chances. Therefore, bishop to c6 does not work either. This leaves only two possible retreats: g2 and h1. Naturally, the move bishop to h1 also fails. After black captures the bishop on f4, white has no way to defend the remaining bishop from the threat of rook to f1. For example, if white retreats with the bishop to g2, black plays rook to g1. Once again, the rook sacrifices itself on the following move, and the position ends in a draw. Therefore, the only correct move is bishop to g2. The idea of this move is that after the rook captures the bishop on f4, white retreats the king to g3. It now becomes clear that not only does the king attack the rook, but it also covers all the potential squares from which the rook could attack the remaining bishop. The rook is forced to retreat, and white can finally realize the main idea of jumping with the knight and giving checks. At this point, you will notice just how effectively the two white pieces control the board. The rook appears to have two entire open files available, yet the squares f1, f2, f3, as well as g4 and h4, are all securely covered. This leaves only two smaller files to consider, and we must analyze how white responds to the rook's retreat on each of those squares. If the rook retreats to f5 or f7, white simply jumps with the knight to d6, delivering check while simultaneously attacking the rook. If the rook retreats to f6 or f8, then white plays knight to c5 check. The king is forced to retreat to b8, and after that comes knight to d7 fork. No matter if the rook stands on f8 or f6, it will be lost on the next move. But the rook has one more file available. Could it really be that the rook is also lost after any retreat along this line? At once, it becomes clear that e4 is not available because of the bishop's control. This leaves only four possible retreats to consider. If the rook goes to a4, white jumps with the knight to c5. If the rook goes to c4, white jumps with the knight to d6. And if the rook retreats to b4 or d4, then white plays knight to d8 check. Regardless of whether the rook is on b4 or d4, white follows up with knight to c6, securing the win. And so, with just 2 pieces, white is able to cut off every possible retreat of the rook on what seems like an empty board, ultimately securing victory. I hope you enjoyed this study. If you truly did, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. If you would like to support the channel, the link is in the description. You can also subscribe to the YouTube membership, where you will gain access to exclusive videos. See you in the next videos.